A hush settles over the temple courts in the early morning light. The sun has barely risen above the Mount of Olives, casting long shadows across the vast stone platform. Priests begin their daily routines. Silver trumpets sound a clear note. Smoke from the first offerings of the day rises straight into a still sky. Near the colonnades, groups of worshippers gather in quiet clusters. Merchants set up small tables of doves for sacrifice. Levites sweep the flagstones where thousands will walk before noon. And among them, unnoticed at first, walk a few Galileans. They are not priests, they are not trained scribes, they are not known figures in the hierarchy of Jerusalem, but they speak with a confidence that draws attention. One lifts his voice above the crowd. His accent marks him as a man from the north. His manner is direct, as though he believes he has been entrusted with something urgent. Weeks earlier, these same Galileans had hidden in fear. One of them, Peter, had denied even knowing Jesus when questioned in the courtyard of the high priest. Yet now he stands in the temple, in the most public location in all Judea, speaking openly about Jesus' death and what he claims happened afterward. This is not a private conversation. This is not quiet persuasion. This is testimony delivered in the heart of Jewish authority, within earshot of the very priests who oversaw the trial of Jesus. The question that hung over Jerusalem was simple. Why did the city's priests fear Galilean testimony? Why did men with power, education, and status feel threatened by the voices of fishermen and laborers? The answer lies in a complex web of authority, purity law, witness regulations, and political balance within the Second Temple period. It also lies in the fragile relationship between the priestly aristocracy and the Roman prefect, and above all, it lies in the nature of testimony itself. A claim made in public could shift the judgment of the people. It could challenge the legitimacy of the Sanhedrin. It could call into question decisions reached only weeks earlier. To understand this fear, the story must return to the days immediately following the death of Jesus. After the crucifixion, the city entered a festival week filled with visitors. The priests who had overseen the proceedings returned to their duties. They expected the matter to fade. Movements built around charismatic teachers usually collapsed once the teacher was removed. The Galilean disciples were scattered. The Roman governor had given his final approval. The temple authorities had affirmed their decision. It appeared finished. Yet soon rumors spread, small at first, fragments of stories told quietly. Some said the tomb was empty. Others claimed that certain followers reported seeing Jesus alive. These claims were not yet public. They circulated in private homes and among close circles. But to the priests, even the whisper of such testimony could spark trouble. The Sanhedrin operated within strict legal traditions. In witness law, testimony carried weight depending on character, reputation, and the circumstances in which it was delivered. Testimony could overturn a judgment only under specific conditions. It could challenge prior rulings. It could force the council into uncomfortable reconsiderations. If Galilean witnesses now claimed that God had vindicated Jesus, the council faced a dilemma. They could attempt to silence the testimony, they could ignore it and let it fade, or they could confront it head-on. Jerusalem's priesthood held immense responsibility. They controlled the sacrificial system, supervised the temple treasury, guarded the purity of the sanctuary, and enforced regulations that shaped the religious life of the entire nation. Most high priests during this era came from a small number of wealthy families aligned with the interests of Rome. These families managed political alliances, negotiated with the prefect, and directed temple operations. This structure created tensions. Many ordinary Judeans, especially those from rural regions, believed the priestly aristocracy had become too closely tied to Roman power. Others respected the stability that such ties offered. Within this complex environment, public challenges could not be taken lightly. Purity regulations added another layer. The temple was the holiest place in the land. Any disruption could render parts of it ritually unfit, requiring extensive cleansing rituals. Priests were responsible for preventing such disruptions. They also had to manage the volatile combination of festival crowds, competing interpretations of the law, and the presence of Roman soldiers stationed in the Antonia fortress overlooking the temple courts. In this environment, a group of Galileans proclaiming that a recently executed man had been raised from the dead and exalted carried significant implications. Resurrection belonged to the realm of divine action. Claims about divine intervention carried weight in public imagination. Testimony delivered in the temple itself implied that the claim was relevant to national identity, worship, and the authority of the priesthood. Some members of the Sanhedrin belonged to the Sadducean party. This group rejected the idea of resurrection and focused on the authority of the written Torah. Others belonged to the Pharisees, who accepted resurrection and emphasized oral traditions. These internal differences further complicated the council's response. If resurrection claims gained traction among the people, Sadducean influence could weaken. Fear grew not simply because resurrection was being proclaimed, but because the proclamation challenged the council's verdict regarding Jesus. If God had raised him, then their judgment had been wrong. In a society grounded in honor, law, and divine oversight, such a possibility was destabilizing. The priests first addressed the matter quietly. Reports indicate that the Galileans were teaching daily in the temple courts. Crowds gathered around them near Solomon's portico. Witnesses described healings, prayers, and bold speeches. The temple guard, overseen by priestly officials, approached them and brought them into custody for questioning. The arrest was not violent. The council knew that any heavy-handed action could spark unrest. They questioned the Galileans about the authority by which they acted. They attempted to reassert control. But the Galileans did not retreat. Their testimony remained firm. They attributed their actions to Jesus, whom they said God had raised. They pointed out that the healed man stood beside them, well known to those who frequented the temple. The council could not deny the healing. They could not dismiss its impact on the crowd. The priests faced a choice: punish the Galileans and risk public outrage, or order them to stop speaking and hope compliance would follow. They chose the latter. The Galileans refused. They said they must obey God rather than human authorities. This refusal struck directly at the foundation of priestly power. The authority of the priests rested on their interpretation of the law, their control of the temple, and their mandate to serve God on behalf of the people. When untrained Galileans challenged their authority by appealing to a higher divine mandate, the council's position weakened. The priests released them under threat, but the testimony did not cease. It increased. More Galileans joined the effort, more healings were reported, more crowds gathered. From the perspective of the priests, the situation was unsustainable. The temple was becoming a stage for a rival interpretation of recent events. The authority of the council was being undermined in the very courts where it was supposed to be displayed. Witness law played a central role in this fear. In Jewish legal tradition, 2 or 3 witnesses could establish a matter. Testimony delivered by credible individuals could shape communal judgment. If many witnesses claimed to have seen Jesus alive, the council risked losing credibility. They had accused Jesus of blasphemy and claimed divine approval for their verdict. If the people believed that God had reversed that verdict, the entire priestly order could be discredited. Another concern involved the Roman prefect. The priests had to maintain stability to keep their position secure. Any disturbance in the temple could provoke Roman intervention. If the Jesus movement grew rapidly and attracted large crowds, Rome might interpret it as rebellion. This would reflect poorly on the priestly aristocracy and could lead to their removal. Thus the fear was not only theological but political. It was not only spiritual but administrative. It was not only about resurrection but about control of public space and public imagination. The Galileans continued to teach. Some sources describe an event in which the apostles were placed in prison overnight. The next morning they were found again in the temple, teaching as usual. To a council already struggling with control, this incident seemed to demonstrate that the movement could not be contained by ordinary measures. The priests brought them again before the council. Frustration grew. They warned them a second time. They emphasized that the Galileans were accusing the leaders of wrongdoing. They insisted on silence. The Galileans replied once more that they could not be silent. At this point, tempers rose within the council. Some members wanted to take harsher actions, but caution prevailed. One respected elder advised restraint, pointing to earlier movements that had faded on their own. His advice was pragmatic. If the movement was not from God, it would collapse. If it was from God, opposition was futile. The council accepted this reasoning not because they agreed with the theological implication, but because it offered a practical way to avoid immediate conflict. They ordered the Galileans flogged, a severe punishment under Jewish law. Then they released them, again commanding silence. The Galileans returned to the temple the next day. To understand the intensity of the priestly fear, one must examine the deeper structure of Second Temple power networks. The high priest held office through Roman appointment. His authority depended on maintaining the favor of the governor. His influence extended through family connections, economic control of temple revenues, and a network of officials who managed daily operations. Purity regulations gave priests legal leverage over the population. Many rituals required priestly involvement. People needed priests for sacrifices, purification after illness, and offerings related to festivals. This created an interdependent relationship between the population and the temple. Yet purity also created vulnerability. Any suggestion that the temple leadership acted in a way that angered God could damage their standing. If the Galileans proclaimed that God had vindicated Jesus and validated his teachings, it cast doubt on the purity of the priest's judgment. The Sanhedrin feared that large crowds might interpret suffering or misfortune as signs of divine displeasure with the leadership. During this period, the memory of the Maccabean revolt and earlier conflicts lingered. The people were sensitive to signs of divine approval or disapproval. Galilean testimony struck at precisely this point. It did not merely claim that Jesus was alive, it claimed that God himself had acted in a decisive way that contradicted the council's verdict. For the people, such testimony could shift perceptions of who truly acted on God's behalf. The priests also feared losing control over teaching. The temple courts were a center of learning. Rabbis, scribes, and teachers gathered there to interpret the law. If the Galileans continued to teach without authorization, it weakened the council's authority to regulate instruction. Another factor was the geographical divide between Judea and Galilee. Galileans were often viewed as outsiders, rustic, less educated, and less respectful of Jerusalem's elite. For the priestly aristocracy, the idea that such men might influence public opinion in the temple was unsettling. It reversed the usual hierarchy in which knowledge flowed from Jerusalem outward. The Galileans' confidence in delivering testimony, despite lacking formal training, reflected a form of authority that priests could not control. The priests feared not only the content of their claims, but the boldness with which they delivered them. Political tension also played a role. The prefect in Jerusalem, responsible for maintaining order, watched the temple carefully during festivals. Any disturbance could lead to quick intervention. Priests who failed to keep peace risked losing their positions. A growing movement proclaiming a recently executed man as a divinely exalted figure could be interpreted as a threat to Roman security. The priests' fear grew each time crowds gathered around the Galileans. Every healing increased their visibility. Every sermon expanded their influence. Every day they remained in the temple courts, challenged the authority of the council. The Sanhedrin also faced competition from other groups. Pharisees offered interpretations of the law that differed from priestly views. Zealots argued for resistance against Rome. Essenes rejected the temple altogether. Into this already crowded field stepped another group claiming direct revelation, healing power, and the reversal of a recent judicial decision. For the priestly aristocracy, this was a dangerous mixture. It threatened their grip on authority, their control of the temple, and the stability they needed to maintain Roman favor. Testimony in the ancient world was not a simple statement, it was a public act with legal force. When witnesses stood in the temple and declared that God had acted, they influenced the community's understanding of divine will. If that testimony contradicted the council could be perceived as opposing God. This was the core of the priestly fear. Not only that people might believe in resurrection, but that people might believe the council had condemned an innocent man favored by God. Such a belief could unravel the council's authority. As time passed, the movement grew beyond Jerusalem, but the earliest episodes in the temple courts reveal the intense struggle between established leadership and disruptive testimony. This struggle shaped Christian identity and influenced Jewish leadership for generations. Some scholars conclude that the fear of Galilean testimony was primarily political, rooted in the fragile balance between Rome and the priesthood. Others argue that it was legal, driven by witness regulations and the risk of overturning judgments. Still others highlight theological concerns, such as resurrection and divine vindication. What remains clear is that the Sanhedrin faced a challenge they could not resolve by ordinary means. The Galileans would not withdraw. They would not remain silent. They continued to speak in the name of Jesus, challenging every level of authority within the city. As this conflict intensified, Jerusalem became the stage for debates about law, purity, prophecy, and divine action. The council stood on one side, the Galileans on the other, and the people listened. Priests feared that the testimony might spread uncontrollably, that it might ignite unrest, that Rome might intervene, that their role as guardians of the temple might collapse, that their interpretation of the law might be questioned, that the authority they had built over generations might erode under the weight of public opinion. Their fear was not irrational. They stood at the intersection of law, religion, and imperial politics. Any shift in one could affect the others. Galilean testimony threatened all three. The story of this fear also invites deeper questions. How did early Christian proclamation shape Jewish self-understanding? How did the internal divisions within the Sanhedrin influence their decisions? How did witness law and purity regulations interact in practice? How did the temple courts function as a space for competing voices? These questions open pathways into the complexity of Second Temple life. They reveal a world where testimony was powerful, where authority was contested, and where a few voices from the north challenged the most prestigious council in the land. The Galileans had no armies, no wealth, and no official status, yet they possessed something the priests could not easily silence. Public testimony delivered boldly in the most sacred space in Judaism. That testimony, whether accepted or rejected, reshaped the future of two religions and left a mark on history that has never faded. And for the priestly aristocracy of Jerusalem, that was reason enough to fear the voices rising from Galilee.